Hello, U.S. History class. It is Thursday, and we're going to pick right back up where we left off yesterday with Calvin Coolidge. Now, he's what we like to call a fiscal conservative. So, all the people that are running, or that were running against Trump, I don't know if they still are at this point, but back in I guess about November, December, there was still people running against Trump for this upcoming 2020 election, and all of them considered themselves fiscal Republicans or fiscal conservatives only. And so that means they didn't necessarily take on the values of what are considered or typical Republican values, such as being pro life and pro legal immigration only. And so that's something that they didn't necessarily take on. So and pro-gun, that's another one that's kind of typically under a Republican or conservative standpoint. So the people that were running against Trump, they were both considered fiscal Republicans, which basically just means they're conservative when it comes to economic points. So not necessarily moralistic points or what we would consider moralistic points, but economic standpoints. And so he really they called him Silent Cow because he really didn't take a whole lot of stances on a whole lot of things. He didn't say a whole lot. He mainly just stuck to what he basically knew well. So that was about it. And he decided that business was just kind of business, and that was the end of the story. Herbert Hoover, now if you think back to the last chapter, we learned that Herbert Hoover was over the Food Administration. He ends up becoming his Secretary of Commerce, and he ends up running as a Republican, and he ends up going against Al Smith. But back in this time period, the first Catholic president was in the 1960s with, 1950s, 1960s, with John JFK. Yeah, John. He was the first Catholic president, so, and it took him a lot to get to be, he had to prove himself over and over that he wasn't going to let the Pope. So you'll have to think back to your world history class, but all throughout world history, there was always this struggle between who was in charge, the Pope or the King, and it came to absolutism was the king had divine rights from God to be the ruler, and the Pope was underneath the king, and it went back and forth and back and forth. King's on top, and the Pope was on top. The king was on top, the Pope was on top. And so nobody could ever decide who was on top. Was it the king or was it the Pope? And so when Al Smith came against Herbert Hoover, he kind of had that as a disadvantage back then, because now people don't really see a whole lot of differences between Catholics and Protestants. And actually, as far as I know, Mike Pence is a Catholic. So we have a Catholic in office right now, and so is Nancy Pelosi, I think, and she's the secretary. She's the Speaker of the House. So we have lots of Catholics in now, and nobody thinks anything of it. But back then, people really feared that the Pope would end up having control over America. If we had a Catholic president, he would have to listen to the Pope, and the Pope would be basically in charge. So people really feared that, and a lot of Protestants really feared that. There was still this big tension between the Protestant and the Catholic Church, even at this point in time in history. So, and something else that he had going against him, that Al Smith did not support the prohibition. So prohibition was just prohibited the sale of alcohol. If you think back, oh goodness, we were still in school meeting when we talked about this last, but they ended up putting a ban on alcoholism because the rise of domestic violence had went up. So they ended up having to put a ban on alcoholism because women were being abused by drunken men. So they ended up, the Christians really put a big movement back then to try to stop the sale of alcohol. And so, but sadly, I don't know that it's was something during this time, even though there was not the sale of alcohol. People met in what was called speakeasies, and they went underneath restaurants, and they hid in the bars. So it was still happening, it just wasn't necessarily allowed. So it was just hidden. But that's kind of where he ends up. So you will be doing activity 1 and 2 that's going to talk a little bit about these two presidents. and Calvin Coolidge especially. He's one that's not necessarily talked about a whole lot in history, and neither is, to be honest, neither are any of the ones that happened during the 1920s. FDR was more well-known president, so when we get to him, you'll probably know about that. We're moving on to culture next week. I'm super excited about moving on to the culture of this. There's a lot of cool stuff happening. Some of it's a review, but William Jennings Bryan is going to be a big part of it. The radio, I'm super excited. We're going to move right along, and then we're going to move right into World War II for the last few weeks. So I'm super excited, and that's all I have for you guys.